Morning, Internet, and welcome to Pearls of Wisdom for September the 22nd. Earlier this week, I had the wonderful opportunity to attend a meeting funded through about 6 of the institutes that make up the collective Canadian Institutes for Health Research here in Canada, with the goal of establishing a pain research agenda for the next almost 10 years here in Canada. It's a lofty goal in 2 days, and I'm not entirely sure we accomplished it, but there was a lot of really good conversation that occurred both during the meeting and outside of the meeting that one in particular I just want to share some reflections on. This meeting brought together academics, clinicians, consumers, so patients, policymakers, people representing diverse groups, including in this case Indigenous populations here in Canada. There were probably 10 or so of the 100 invitees, I would say. I'm just estimating here that were representing First Nations peoples. And I had a really nice opportunity on the second day to sit in on what was called the Indigenous Peoples Caucus during lunch, which was essentially an opportunity for that particular group to sit around some tables and talk in their own way about the nature of the discussions to that point on pain research in particular in Canada. And of course, as you might expect, they were very welcoming to anyone else who wanted to come and listen, and quite respectful of others. And I was quite happy to join and listen in sort of as a fly on the wall to some of this conversation. I just want to share some of my experiences and subsequent reflections on that. One of the things that struck me immediately, first of all, this is almost going to sound strange, I suppose, but let me just say it up front, I guess, and I'm not sure if you want to call this a side effect of my somewhat sort of white bread upbringing or some kind of latent racism or something. I'm not sure, but this is a very, not surprisingly, these are a clever group of people. Just to be clear, these were medically trained physicians. These were CIHR-funded academics, researchers, who just happened to have a ethnic background of one of our First Nations populations here in Canada. But, and maybe I'm speaking to my sort of fellow, white friends, I suppose, out there. But this is a very switched-on group. Let me just be clear about that. And I maybe the fact that I'm as impressed as I was perhaps is a bit telling, and I'm not sure exactly what that means. But nonetheless, let me just say that this was a very, very clever, very switched-on group. And another thing though that became immediately obvious to me is that when I say I'm measuring health, when I create scales that I believe are measuring health, I have come to realize, as a result of these conversations, that what I'm measuring is a somewhat narrow view of health, is a sort of Westerner's kind of white European type of view of health that is probably not necessarily applicable across cultures. And this is why cross-cultural adaptation of scales, I suppose, is done with as much rigor as it is these days, because what I think of as health, as it turns out, is very different from what, for example, our Indigenous peoples think of as health. And I quickly came to learn, for example, that seeking health from a First Nations provider, seeking health care, I should say, would include not only seeing a medically trained physician, but also an elder or a healer, or an elder healer, I guess, often in the same place. And the two work together to arrive at a more holistic view of health that necessarily includes a real spiritual aspect, and this concept of sort of spiritual connection with the earth, and also with your ancestors, and also the people that come after you. So this sort of belief that your current health and well-being is related to the 7 generations that came before you and the 7 generations that are coming after you. which is interesting. And I mean, it has sort of, I guess, if I wanted to put this in a scientific perspective, it has parallels in the epigenetics field. But even in a little bit more sort of, let's say, a religious perspective, this also has parallels in Buddhism, for example. I don't measure, I have never seen a scale that measures the degree one feels in synchrony with the earth or with their ancestors or their future generations. And it wasn't until I had a chance to really talk to these folks that I understood their concerns around trying to fit traditional research models into research on indigenous or health approaches. That the traditional models we use really probably aren't applicable, probably can't work to empirically validate those approaches. Another interesting piece that I became aware of during the conversation is that even the concept of healthcare and the concept of health, again, as we think about it in our sort of, in a Western culture, I guess, probably skews a little bit towards sort of hedonic views of health and well-being, which is, to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. And in doing so, we've developed these approaches to managing pain, for example, many of which include cut out the worn part and replace it with something synthetic and new. And that approach, that sort of just assumed, well, you got a bad knee? Here, look, we'll cut it out and replace it with something new. What's the issue? Assuming everybody is okay with that, I have come to realize, is probably inaccurate again. That there are not just our indigenous peoples, but many cultures that really believe that the body, the holism of the body, is important, and that if you start to cut parts out of it, you don't just willy-nilly pull pieces off. You don't just dump them into a bin somewhere. That all parts of your body are sacred. And I start to realize again that when I see people, especially from cultural backgrounds or belief systems that are different than mine, who seem to be struggling to make a decision around undergoing surgery or not, it's probably not just that they're fearful of the knife, but that there's a much deeper, much more spiritual aspect to this decision-making that needs to be considered. And we saw some of this. My grandfather, who's now passed away, but 10 years ago when he was struggling with his health, he was also a Jehovah's Witness. And in that particular belief system that he followed, blood transfusions, taking blood from someone else, was not to be done. And again, it's a very, you realize just this is a very difficult situation when I might think, well, listen, Poppy, the way you're going to get healthier is to get this blood transfusion. Seems to make sense. But the belief systems there that I probably didn't adequately consider at the time made that decision much more difficult, added additional layers to the decision, and in fact, he ultimately did not get the blood transfusions. But that was okay, and I guess that's sort of my point. He was able to pass on in peace with himself that he had stuck to his belief systems. And I'm now seeing the same thing, having come out of this conversation with Indigenous cultures and other cultures now. Canada is one of the world's most multicultural countries, and I'm realizing that the concepts of health, as we've traditionally defined them, are going to necessarily have to be expanded as we go forward and as this world becomes a much more diverse place, as we stop sort of just living in little pockets. But now we look at places like Toronto, that I think maybe 2 years ago was the world's most multicultural city. And just understanding that health in different, whether they be cultural backgrounds, whether they be different ethnic backgrounds, whether they be for different sexual orientations or even age groups and generational differences, we need to expand our concepts of health. So I want to thank the wonderful folks who were representing the Indigenous populations at the CIHR Pain Summit earlier this week for being as open and welcoming and frankly as willing to share their thoughts as they were. I'm looking forward to getting more exposure to health in these populations next year, and I will talk more about that in a subsequent blog. So for now, hopefully that gives you something to think about as we continue on our pursuit for health and well-being, whatever that may be. Cheers.